Welcome to the Stewart Squared podcast. We've got another episode. Last week we talked to Gilman Louie, uh, the partner at Alsop Louie, about some very interesting stuff in terms of how Gilman and you met. Today we're going to talk about the evolution of business as it went from the 1980s to today, how it's changing today, and maybe we'll even talk about the history of SEO because now I'm starting to get into web development and also I've learned a lot about how LLMs are changing SEO. But let's start with the history of business. What was the biggest thing you learned in 1980 to 1985 about how business was done, either in the whole business sector or within technology?
Wow. Um, when I started, 1980-ish, um, your great Uncle Joe, your Uncle Joe, um, had been in the business since the 60s. And this is the technology business. And so the tech business was separate and operated on its own dynamics. And in that era, what had become true was the sort of ground truth is that IBM was the big cheese. And they practiced something called account control. And so they would engage in a relationship with their customers where the customers, because it was contractual, the customers couldn't really get rid of them. And that was account control. Um,
Was
and
it,
that was,
wait, sorry, but was IBM a monopoly?
it was accused of being a monopoly,
Uh,
like Microsoft, um, power tends to suggest monopoly. Um, And there was a group of other companies called the Bunch, Burroughs, Univac, NCR, Control Data, and Honeywell. Yeah, there we go. Um, they were the kind of other ones besides IBM. And then things happened like uh, Digital Equipment Corporation came along and started selling mini computers, and they sold it on different terms. And so that began to weaken.
hmm.
Uh, But the presumption was that IBM was, you had to kind of work your way around IBM if you wanted to start a new company or if you wanted to become successful. Um, so starting in the 80s, the personal computer showed up, and people imagined that that would change how business was done in the tech business, but they only imagined it because the early personal computers weren't that good, ultimately, compared to what they are now. And there was no internet. And so the computer business ended up kind of two different businesses, IBM slash DEC,
Uh,
big computer enterprise business, and the personal computer business. And they were both isolated from the rest of the economy, right? So the personal computer business became more and more important and eventually changed the reference point, and the reference point became Microsoft um, in the PC business. And meanwhile, all companies went off and did their own business, and according to whatever it was, um, banks, industrial companies, all the stuff that's being talked about today about how we exported all the jobs to China, all that stuff started happening back then. Um, and so it wasn't really until the internet happened that the division between the tech industry and the rest of the economy began to dissolve. And
yeah. Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
so, the sort of second generation of tech was when the internet started, and you ended up with like Google as the search
Hmm.
company. They supplanted Yahoo, but and stuff started to happen on the internet, and the original internet was kind of slow and hinky, so you could do search, and search was amazing. Google in 1999 was doing amazing stuff, but it was still on a relatively slow internet, which was being built out over time. And then we got into what we refer to as the second convergence, but where the internet got good enough to do social media, to do cloud storage, to do all this stuff that's been happening over the last 15 years. And that's when the tech business started infiltrating every other business, banking, retailing, everything. And the more competent and more useful the internet became, the more it started applying to every other business. And of course, the penultimate of this is on AI, but that's almost a different topic. But so the sort of generations of what's the reference point for how computing is done and tech is done, and how much that relates to the rest of the economy. And
Mhm.
now it's completely integrated.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and that's why all the focus on the big tech companies are viewed as being super powerful. And, the Fed FTC is suing Meta to break them up. Um,
Still, even
and
under Trump?
yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Zuckerberg just went and testified in Washington last week. Um, and he tried to get out of it. He tried to call Trump up and say, drop this thing. It was started under
Yeah.
the first Trump. It was
Oh,
accelerated during Biden.
yeah.
And now we have Trump 2,
Yeah.
and they're going right after him.
Yeah.
And there's all this analysis about whether, being buddies with Trump really pays off. In case of Zuckerberg, he's stuck with it and has to deal with it. So in that particular case, it's a very novel interpretation of antitrust law that they shouldn't have bought Instagram for $1 billion in
That's what it has to
2000.
do with, is Instagram?
Yeah,
Wow,
yeah,
interesting.
Instagram and then WhatsApp, which they paid 19 billion for
Yeah.
a year later. So they bought two key companies, and in retrospect, it was brilliant. Like you got to give Zuckerberg credit for this because people didn't understand at the time that social media would be a thing, which now Meta owns it, right? The only other
Yeah.
thing besides that is TikTok and Twitter,
Yeah.
and Snap is kind of a minor
Yeah.
player. And so he was brilliant what he did. Right now, they're going to say, well, now he's created an effective monopoly and it has to be broken up, which is probably not going to happen. Most people don't expect it to happen because this is not Trump making the decision. It is the judge.
FTC, the FTC, no, the FTC is suing, but a judge, it's under a court. And this brings to mind, this is why I love the show, is because it's so interconnected to politics and other things. But
Yeah,
yeah,
uh, two Democrats on the Federal Trade Commission, two of the commissioners, the Democratic commissioners both resigned. So there's only three commissioners now, and they're all Republican.
what is a
Thank me.
commissioner?
Well, Federal Trade Commission is run by
Uh,
a commission, and there
uh,
are five commissioners that run the Federal Trade Commission. It's supposed to be independent of the Justice Department, which is controlled by anyway,
Wait,
you get
wait.
into.
So, and this is the independent agency within the Federal Trade Commission is an independent agency within the executive branch, and it does things through a commission, through a committee.
And Federal Trade Commission kind of investigates, and then the Justice Department implements. And
Hmm. Man, our
so,
system's so crazy, so complex.
I mean, there's a complex web of kind of
Yeah.
relationships that were established over decades, and Trump has just pulled this whole thing apart. So it's a little
Well,
unclear.
that's the craziest thing about what Trump is represents and what he does is because we have the independent agencies coming in with FDR and then starts this whole thing where they're this small little thing and he uses it instead of pack. He tried to pack the Supreme Court. He couldn't do that, so he rammed the independent agencies through and essentially created the modern infrastructure for the enlarged executive branch. And now Trump it has won on the promise that he'll, as an executive, remove the executive power, which is really interesting. And
Right.
yeah,
That's the wrong way to say it. What Trump's doing is solidifying executive power and not allowing Congress to change what he says.
but
And
that's
that,
the interesting part because all of the deep state, all of the things that are the deep state, not all of them, a huge percentage of the deep state is underneath the executive branch in things like the FTC, and it's all decentralized. So
and
the
agents, yeah.
yeah. So and this is where there's some ruling with the Chevron ruling.
Chevron,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Chevron is, you know, the executive branch gets to interpret the laws that Congress passes because Congress can't possibly figure out the details of implementing them. So the
Yeah,
executive branch,
yeah,
that's the Chevron rule.
yeah,
And um, and the deep state went too far.
yeah.
So there was a big Supreme Court decision that
Okay, but
undermined.
so, and that's a really interesting. We can talk about that later. But I want to go back to the question of uh, how did business run in the 1980s, and what are the rules that you learned about business there? In like because we started this conversation because of
Yeah,
NDAs and investments, and you said things are changing. I want to get to that. How are
yeah,
things changing what they used to be?
yeah. So I'm an old fart. Your uncle's an even older fart, 7 years. And so we're all a product of kind of our upbringing and what we experienced when we were growing up and learning how to get along. And going even further back, my father's, your grandfather's generation were the Depression generation who lived through the Depression when it was very hard to get money and food, and so you had a particular attitude. And then after that, it was kind of World War II, and you get into further generations. So there's always this evolution happening based on your experiences. And um, so business was done differently than it is now. And this is what I was saying to you is like, you were asking me about non-disclosure agreements, and I go, well, journalists don't even think about it. And I used to be a journalist. And venture capitalists don't even think about it either, because if you can't trust your VC, you shouldn't be doing business with them, and that would put the VC out of business pretty quickly if they get the reputation of spilling the beans. The so the way business was done is it's hard to imagine now because we had telephones.
Yeah.
I grew up with telephones, and when I started watching TV, it was black and white, and it became color. And there were airplanes. The first when we would go on vacation in the summer to Aspen, Colorado, the flight from this is
Yeah.
barely in my memory, but in the 50s, when we flew from Washington, D.C. to Denver, we had to stop to refuel, like in Kansas City. And then we would switch and fly in a little. Originally, we drove, but then later we get rent a plane and fly over the mountains to Aspen in a prop plane. And I mean, this is just this was amazing that you could do this. Technology hadn't happened. I mean, it was all happening in companies, really only starting in the 50s and 60s. And so technology was not an experience people had, other than watching TV and uh, uh, that's it. Watching TV was a big deal, right? Before that, it was all radio. um, so business was done the way business was done, and it was really
On the
established
telephone.
Hmm?
On the telephone.
On the telephone. Um, fax was a big deal at some point.
What kind of things would you fax?
Documents, right? It would give you a better way than trying to send the document by mail. FedEx was a big deal because, and I think it started in the 70s, where they had this line: if it absolutely positively has to be there tomorrow, overnight, they could deliver a document overnight
73.
through their own airplane fleet. And that was a radical thing. So, how you shared information, like we had that anecdote with Gilman, that a friend of ours called the both of us up and said we should meet each other. Well, that meant they had to pick up the telephone and call us, get us on the phone, or maybe we saw them in person. And it's a guy named Paul Sappho, by the way. I forgot that the last time. And so then I called Gilman, right? I picked up the phone and I dialed the phone number I had for him, and he answered the phone. So I talked to him and I said, "Well, Paul Sappho said we should," and I mean, we did go that whole anecdote. I had to get the map book out and figure out where he was and drive there, but you didn't know any different. Here's another anecdote. When the first iPhone came out, it would have been iPhone 1 or 2, 3. I went to Hong Kong and I had a layover, and I'd heard about this restaurant in Hong Kong. This at that time when the airport was right in Hong Kong. No, actually, this is when it had been moved. I took the subway. I had like an 8-hour layover, something like that. Took the subway into Hong Kong, Kowloon, and used the iPhone map. It was like, whoa, to find this restaurant, and I walked like a mile or so to go find it. And when I got to the restaurant, I had a great meal. It was dim sum. And it was worth every reputation it had. And then I had to walk back to the train station, and my iPhone was like getting down to the last bit of power to get back on the subway and go back into the airport and take my next flight to wherever I was going. And that's like so the increments here, um, we're just used to it now. It's like
So
what do you do if you don't have your phone and you need to know where you're going?
there's one
Uh,
just personal interest question, which is, did you have more fun then than whether you had more fun now? But I want to go into that because I want to go into how did the mediums of exchange change the business? Like you talked about the technology aspects of the business, but how were the relationships done, and how did that change? And I would, if I were a betting man, I would bet that it changed after 2008. That's when in your sense, maybe the business rules of business beyond the technology, although influenced by the technology, may have become hollowed out. Is that how you think they're different?
no, it became a competitive issue, right? So people that
Uh,
adopted the technology and learned how to use it. This is going on with AI right now.
yeah,
The
yeah,
the meme of that,
yeah.
people in the boardroomes,
Using
the
their heads
director
to,
going to
yeah,
the CEO, what are you doing with AI?
yeah, yeah,
Like nobody knows actually what they're talking about.
yeah, yeah,
Same thing was going on back then. What are you doing about the internet?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and uh, so it changed incrementally. So it's very hard to kind of suss out exactly when it changed. But, you know, email arrived in 1994. It was very primitive and proprietary. There
Uh-huh.
was no kind of standard systems for using the,
Ooh.
different apps with the same email.
Wait, wait,
Um,
wait, wait, wait. Oh, is that why Gmail got popular? Is
well,
because they
that
standardized
was
it?
later, actually.
Yeah.
Um, That was why AOL got popular.
Uh-huh.
AOL had its own proprietary email system as well as CompuServe and others. Uh, Apple had one at some point called Apple Mail, which never grew out of Apple, so it went away. But
Hmm.
so the systems
Hmm.
for sending email became standardized. The protocols for distributing an email correct.
So I've been reading Eric S. Raymond's book, which was the book you suggested about Cathedral and the Bazaar, and
Yeah.
he shares the open source world of how open source development, which is really interesting and has a lot of applications to development. And his first thing was a fetch pop, something like some sort of random protocol in this world that you're talking about. Can we talk about the technical, like why was it so difficult to set up email and an email app?
Well, look at an email address,
Yeah.
something at
Uh-huh.
something, something. Um, the dominant dot something was dot com
Uh-huh.
uh, as the internet was exploding. An organization of how that was organized,
Uh-huh.
that was mysterious. And
Uh-huh.
we talked about that a little bit. ICANN and
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
entities were involved in setting the standards for this,
Yeah.
but the companies that ran email servers had to agree to certain standards.
Mm.
Um, and I'm not technical enough to remember exactly what they are, but you had to agree that whatever came after the dot defined a general domain, and what became before the dot defined the
Oh.
specific domain you're sending to, and the at before the at sign was the address that had to be unique, right? Because you couldn't have two. I have this phenomenon right now. Actually,
Yeah.
my email is salsop@gmail.com, and I've had it ever since Gmail
Yeah.
started
Yeah.
because as soon as Gmail started, I went and got SLSUP on it. Someone else managed to, and I can't figure this out, get s.allsup@gmail.com.
So now you're getting
Now,
emails
in
from him.
theory,
Yeah.
in the rules, s.allsup is identical to sallsup. There's no dots. You can't put dots in front of the at sign.
Mm. Yeah, go for it. Mhm.
Um, so, uh, so I have that problem right now, and there's someone else out there like seeing some of my email, and I can't figure this thing out. Anyway, that's just an example of kind of you have to have this level of standardization that everybody agrees to, and so it took a while for everybody to agree on general email protocols for how email was defined, how it got routed through servers and then
Yeah.
delivered, what
Okay.
read receipts were, and how that all interaction
Read
happened.
receipts.
Yeah.
What are read receipts?
you get a message back that says the message was read.
Was sent, or no, was read.
Oh, read.
Yeah,
Opened.
yeah, yeah.
That
Yeah,
iMessage gives you read receipts too.
yeah. And so that was a protocol. This question of standardization is something really interesting.
It's called, let's see if I can remember this. EMAP, email access protocol, something like that.
Um, so
SMAP. Yeah, there's a, so it's been long enough that I've kind of lost the,
this question of standardization is really interesting because it's like it's fascinating. I like to study empires and empires rising and falling. And the Byzantine Empire, like there are a lot of reformers. And I actually have this question that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is whether Trump is a reformer or a revolutionary. He has the language of a revolutionary, but I think that he's more of a reformer. But we'll leave that. But because standardization is
oh, there.
this is this thing in the 90s. It's really interesting because you had a whole, like in the 90s it was, I've only recently started to become much more explicit in my own mind about it, but the United States became the global hegemon in the 1990s. That's just like that happened. And under the golden age of this hegemon, there are all these things that happened with
It
the
happened way earlier than that. When
well,
did the,
but this,
when
I
did
mean, it
Russia,
was, yeah, it was happening throughout the time, but then Russia fell though, and the only
as
thing that
soon as Russia
was,
fell, and we didn't not understand this at the time, and this was a failure of imagination, the US became the only world power because
yeah,
China hadn't developed
yeah,
yet.
yeah,
And just because we were the only world power, people started to mistrust us,
yes, true,
started to view us as bad,
yeah,
not good.
yeah,
We'd been good all the way up.
yeah,
And we kept thinking we were good, but
yeah.
everybody else started thinking we weren't.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's really important to understand because we had that power. We had 11 aircraft carriers in rotation around the world, and we could project our power everywhere, and nobody could stop us.
Yeah,
And we thought we were good. So, we didn't do very much of that. But everybody else is going, holy crap, they can come in here anytime they want. And we did do some things
yeah.
like Iraq, you know. Um,
But we were doing things the entire time. It's just before that we had an existential threat, sometimes as an
yeah.
excuse, sometimes as a
Well,
real thing.
anybody who wasn't part of the duopoly
Yeah,
was like sitting there going, well, we like those guys better than we
yeah,
like those guys.
yes, yeah, yeah.
And
Uh,
communists.
but but then in the 90s, the standardization thing that you're talking about, because that happened when the United States was at its power, and those things are related, right? The
And
fact
it
that
came from the
yeah,
US.
yeah,
The US agreed on those standards because no one else had technology the way we had it.
yeah.
Japan had some, but they decided not to adhere to the standards until it was too
Oh,
late, and they
ooh,
had to
interesting.
work with the U.S. standards. Um, but you send an email to a guy in China, the same rules apply.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
After the dot, before the dot, and before the at sign. That's you know they can't change that. They can't go create a new China standard for how email is delivered.
It's almost like the dollar too, because it's like we're riding on the coattails of this really interesting thing that happened in the 90s where we had the institutional power, not only hard power, but the soft power to go and establish a worldwide standard, not only
Okay,
because of
that
the
did
internet.
not happen in the 90s. That happened in the 50s. The US currency, the dollar,
Yeah,
became the reference. Now, originally it was marked to gold, right? You
yeah,
could convert a dollar into a certain amount of gold, and it was standardized. Then we left the gold standard. The only currency that anybody believed in was the dollar. And it wasn't because we did something
yeah,
other than just being a powerful
yeah.
economy and entity. Um, but you couldn't. And so when Obama started, this interesting experience where I don't know why, but I went to a briefing by several of the cabinet members. And this is just, a couple of months after he's started as president.
In 2001.
And yeah. And so I flew to Washington and I went to this briefing. And I remember the Treasury Secretary, whose name I can't remember now, wore cowboy boots. And I was sitting in front. I saw his cowboy boots. But I had to ask this question because I went, China was beginning its run. She wasn't premier yet, but they were opening up, and there were Chinese companies and venture capital and so forth. And so I asked the Treasury Secretary this question: How would the dollar not be the reserve currency anymore? Now, this is 2008, so it's 17 years ago. And he said, and this has stuck with me ever since, because now people are asking about the reserve currency thing. Um, he said, well, there has to be an alternative. There has to be some other currency that people would believe in. And you go, not the ruble,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, not the ruble even today, not the euro, because the euro is not a single central bank. They have a central bank. That's weak. Um, not the rupee. I mean, he went through them all. And
Yeah.
he said, definitely not the yuan.
Yeah.
And uh, so you sit there and you go, okay, has that changed?
No.
Is there a currency that anyone else will trust?
Bitcoin.
And I don't think that's true. So I think we're still the reserve currency because, what are people going to move to? Right?
Bitcoin.
During Trump's craziness, there was a run on the euro, and the dollar fell, but like it's like the euro.
Well, I think it's going to be Bitcoin. I think it's going to be the dollar for a long
Yeah,
time.
okay. So yeah,
Yeah.
we've had that.
Yeah. Because and
Maybe.
it relates
But
to the email. Yeah.
Bitcoin can't be a reserve currency because you don't know whether you can trust it or not. I mean, there's still this issue of
I trust it.
sure, you've got the ledger,
Yeah.
in theory you have a contract and it's stable, but shit, people still lose billions of Bitcoins. It's like it's not secure.
Yeah, but all
Uh,
those things happened with gold as well. The gold was really insecure. You had to move it a bunch of times, and people stole it all the time. So yeah, those things exist.
Fort
But
Knox
yeah, yeah,
still where it is, $52 billion of gold sitting in Fort Knox.
yeah. But I think it'll be the U.S. dollar and the Bitcoin, and this really relates to the article you sent to me about Argentina, which is really funny that Milei gets elected. Milei is this anarcho-capitalist who wants explicitly is trying to get rid of the central bank in Argentina, and then Trump gets elected. They're buddy buddy, but their ideologies are almost completely opposite. Yeah,
That's because Milei is an economist.
yeah, yeah. That's
So
the
I should
reality
send you this
TV
other
show.
thing. This guy wrote an article about we're into Trump again, but I'll try to say this simply. He said, there's no way to predict what Trump's doing because Trump doesn't even know what he's
Yeah,
doing.
yeah,
And so anybody that sits here and goes, well, this or that
yeah,
all gets proven wrong because
yeah,
nobody can predict Trump, not even himself.
yeah,
And so it's like there's no policy, no strategy, no,
yeah.
it's just randomness. And Millet is actually rational and knows what he's talking about. So he is actually on a program to change the Argentine economy in a way that, whether it's crypto or not, um, he's taking the tariffs off mostly. And that's what the article was talking about. But he's doing it in a measured, uh, realistic way, and he's taking some risk, right? Inflation is still 56%.
Um, and the funny thing is that Millet he is very clear about his goals, and one of those goals is to remove the central bank. And this is funny because Trump is trying to do this right now. But Millet is also at his core really crazy compared to what you were talking about in terms of that 1950s to 2020, where all of a sudden the United States was planning everything, had good regulatory clearance, everything was really upfront and really transparent and like transparent government. And like that is no longer an option anywhere. That feels like it's going away, that's not something that will be with us in the future.
Well, it feel like that now, but I think ultimately it will prove out that it'd be better to have uh, open trade.
Well,
The,
but
the
not
problem is
necessarily.
you
Yeah, no, I
can't let some
agree.
people
Yeah,
can't let some people control trade and not others.
yeah,
And that probably is the heart of where Trump is right that, we let it go too long.
yes. Yeah, it's so wildly complex. It's so hard to figure out what's going on. But I want to go back to this question of business. Actually, let's talk about SEO. In 1999, Google comes out, makes it possible to search the internet in this way. What is the evolution of SEO, and how did that affect business?
So Bill Gross was a key
Yeah,
player in that. Um, so if you could buy search, then logically speaking, you could optimize search. So
Mm.
search engine optimization was how do you
Mhm.
present to the search engine a way that will get you a better result than anyone else. Um, and it was a big hell of an evolution because when Google came out, there was no economic, no unit economics attached to search. It just
Mm.
search was like amazing and the
Mm.
traffic zoomed. And it was a couple of years until they figured out how to charge for search. And that's why I say Bill Gross, he was the guy that figured it out. Um, and uh, so So search engine optimization is based on the presumption that you're buying search terms, you're buying search. And um, so SEO has been the way that you've optimized search, right? And there are other forms of advertising, like banner advertising, and um, but SEO optimizes the biggest part of search, which is the other antitrust thing that's going on right now. And with it, where Google is being charged with monopoly and also proposed that they should break that up.
Mm.
Um, and um, so uh, SEO still rules, but a good portion of search now is done through social media. And search engine optimization doesn't work the same way
Yeah.
in social media. Social media, it's a
Behavior,
different
right?
dynamic.
It's categories of people and behavior, right?
Yeah, and there is. I mean, in Facebook, you can buy uh, uh,
Search terms. Yeah.
not search terms,
Yeah.
but you're buying demographics, right?
Yeah.
I want
Yeah. Yeah.
50-year-old guys
Yeah.
in Florida or whatever. And that's not search engine optimization, that's targeting.
Yeah.
And social media is much more about targeting.
Uh,
Um, but now, and this is probably why you wanted to go here, is neither are likely to work
mm.
in a world where AI is channeling people information. Um, and nobody really knows how it's supposed to work. And that's, Bill Gross is out doing pro rata to get people paid for, training LLMs. And, you can believe whatever you want to believe. And Bill never bet against Bill. Um, but there's going to be a new model, and nobody really knows what it is.
Well, and ChatGPT just released memory, and actually, it's kind of worrying for me in terms of profiling because social media was allowed to profile us as demographics. They didn't really care about profiling us as individuals, although it happens or it could happen. ChatGPT with memory now profiles individually our emotional perceptual matrix in a way that's never been possible.
Yeah,
What does
I
that
think you
mean?
can opt out. I can't remember if it's an opt-in or an opt-out, but
I think it's automatic now. But that like not only for the advertising, but also for like, and I interviewed a guy who on Crazy Wisdom on Friday who is building agent businesses, so voice agents to replace customer service people. And the last question before we ran out of time was persuasion. And he answered it in a way. I asked him like, "Will these voice bots be able to persuade humans?" And he answered in this way that it's like, "Oh, well, Sam Altman said, Sam Altman was asked what is the most important skill you can teach your kids, and it's persuasion because these things aren't really great at that really human dynamic of persuasion." But I think that's like a deflection. Like I think these things are really good at persuasion, and a human being behind them making them persuade somebody is actually a real information threat to our cognitive security. What do you think?
sound like a doomer.
uh, I've got elements of it, but I'm optimistic of where we're headed with technology. But I also represent like from 2008 onwards, there were some really drastic changes that to cognitive security that I think all of us can agree on. Is just like we all now
Uh,
we have
the age of
reality TV
social
shows.
media is over, right? The whole thing about
Yeah,
misinformation and
yeah,
political persuasion, all that kind of stuff is done.
yeah.
And the fact that, you know, Facebook just introduced tab for friends and family. It's like trying to go back to what got
What
them
it was before.
going in the beginning, because I think they know that they're kind of toast
Yes.
in Facebook.
Yeah.
And um, so uh, and TikTok is really, the algorithm. Um, and but I get the sense that we're about to go into a new evolution that will undermine all the value. So this, I mean,
Yeah.
here
Yeah.
I'll do this
Yeah.
explicitly. The FTC is suing Meta for being a monopoly because they bought Instagram and WhatsApp, and combined with Facebook, they have this monopoly on social media. What if social media stops mattering?
Yeah. 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 Sounds like
And
a new
if
article.
it stops mattering, Meta will be has been, and I think actually Zuckerberg knows this, and that's why
Yeah.
he's so focused on VR and AR.
Well, Andy's
Uh,
trying to flood the internet with bots, like explicitly flood the Facebook with AI, and users hated it because I don't think people want to go into that world. And he's like, "Well, let's go into that world because that world will mean that there's like some revenue model that still works for me." Yeah,
yeah, so,
yeah, go for it. Yeah,
but I've got, and this is one of those things where I can't prove it,
yeah,
but I'm pretty sure of it. I feel it myself. It's like I think Threads is actually kind of semi-entertaining.
uh,
So I go on,
uh,
do it when I'm sitting on the toilet or not doing
uh,
something else, and which is what I used to do with Twitter,
yeah,
eh, you know, ever so long ago, and Instagram,
uh,
and um, Facebook was a whole different thing. But so I think we're going to go into a
social
world
media
where
no longer
social
matters.
media doesn't drive behavior anymore. Um, Question is, so what will and how does it work, and how do companies make money off of it? I mean, OpenAI is generating billions of dollars of revenue. Um,
And they want to
from
build a social network too. They just
Yeah, I said,
yeah.
I don't know if I put this on Substack, but remember when Google made a social network? They're going like, holy crap, our search business is threatened by all these
Yeah,
social media companies.
yeah,
We
yeah,
have to make a social network.
yeah.
And it sucked because they were not a social media company. Same thing. OpenAI is not a social media company. They don't, that's a total, like, generated only by competitive
Yeah,
juice.
reaction is a reactionary move rather than a forward-thinking move.
Yeah.
Um, so I like this question of what will it look like next? It's one I've been asking about. Uh, and is it just maybe the flood of AI on the internet like keeps the internet as a place where we learn, keeps the internet where we do other things, but the social relationships move then back into person, unless it's like one-on-one or some group chats. Does that sound like the world we're headed to?
Well, here's the way I think about it. Uh, I can't trust the results of anything I do on AI
Yeah.
any more than I do on Google. But
Yeah.
now Google's doing Gemini and its search results. But um, as long as I can't trust them, I have to have a role to play.
Mm,
And the role
mm,
that I play,
mm,
at least for me, I refer to as intuition. And I
hmm.
don't think AI can intuit
I
things.
agree. Yeah.
And as long as we can intuit things, because intuition is not a rational ones and zeros kind of process. It's like magic. Um, and I think that's how we keep a roll. Now, the AI companies might figure out a way to generate revenue. I don't think it's going to be advertising now. I
Yeah.
just don't think so. I think it, and maybe it'll be more like SEO where you
There's a link in there, and the link leads to a business.
yeah
Chat results.
you inject commercial results into
Yeah.
I don't I'm not I just don't know, and I don't think anybody does.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody's trying everything,
Yeah.
and right now the only metric people can go by is, well, OpenAI is generating more revenue than Anthropic, but Anthropic's generating a fair amount of revenue, and Perplexity's generating a fair amount of revenue, and there are all these AI companies that have revenue. Like, oh, where the hell is all this revenue coming from? Who's
Mm.
paying?
It's
Who's
users, right? Users subscription is the
Well,
SaaS
half
model.
of it in OpenAI, half of it is from the Chat GPT, but the other half is from enterprise.
Oh yeah.
And what the hell? I don't, AI is showing up everywhere and it's almost completely useless, right? And
Yeah.
it's built in.
Yeah.
LinkedIn
Yeah.
starts telling me how to
Yeah.
write posts, and
Yeah.
need it to do
Yeah.
that. And I had the classic is in, I get my Exchange mail, my Microsoft mail, which is our work, um, in Apple Mail. And Apple Mail summarizes spam right along with everything else. So it's like you're sitting there going, it's not smart enough to know that it's spam.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
And
all
if it knew
broken.
it was spam, it'd just get rid of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Right?
all broken.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really like this point. And it's the same with Notion. I'm taking notes on Notion right now and the AI features on Notion, and they were the first ones to come out, and everybody was looking at all the engineers like, "Oh, look at Notion. They're doing such a good job with AI. They did all these fancy tech things in the background, and it's still just not useful at all." And that's with everything. Google now is apparently you can use the inside of Sheets. You can use AI inside of Sheets in a way that Microsoft kept on promising for a long time, but didn't expand, but
You know what,
yeah,
how that is? Do you know what that is?
no, no.
I don't know. I use Sheet. I'm still using a spreadsheet the same way I used VisiCalc
Yeah,
50 years ago.
yeah, yeah. Okay, interesting stuff. Well, I guess we'll see. Well, that'll wrap it up for today, and tune in next week.